He wasn't quite sure which was stranger, the fact that he'd somehow won a seat at the Unity banquet aboard the Aurora's Grace, or the fact that the seat directly beside him belonged to Saris Alley herself, the woman whose beauty was the stuff of whispered legend, painted starlight, and half the known galaxy's dreams. He'd spent the first half-hour glancing sidelong, trying desperately not to look too often and failing spectacularly. Every time he caught the curve of her profile, the graceful sweep of those impossibly long ears that shimmered like polished pearl under the hall's floating light orbs, he forgot how to swallow. His water glass had become an anchor for his hands, gripped so tightly he suspected it might fuse with his skin. The banquet itself was a marvel of absurd excess. Servers floated across the hall on repulsor lift discs, trays bearing gravity-defying dishes that trembled like living art. A live nebula display swirled above the center table, casting shifting hues of violet and silver over the gathered dignitaries. Somewhere in the distance, a choir of synth voices sang in chords that sounded like falling rain on glass. And here he sat, ordinary in every way, wearing a rental suit that smelled faintly of ion detergent and last week's nervous guest. The translator bud in his ear clicked softly, translating the swirl of alien dialects around him into a polite, slightly amused voice. When the servers approached again, he nearly dropped his fork. The dish presented was a floating orb of liquid gold, held together by a thin magnetic field. He watched his neighbor, a dignitary with skin like polished obsidian and 6 jewel-encrusted fingers, pierce the orb expertly. Liquid gold spiraled up into a delicate glass flute. In his attempt to copy the motion, he poked too hard, bursting the orb spectacularly. The golden soup leapt into the air and splashed across his sleeve. He was still dabbing at the mess with a nanocloth when Saris turned to him, her gaze soft, lips curved in something perilously close to amusement. "You're new to these dishes, I see," she said, her voice low and musical, translator matching her tone with near reverence. His face burned so hot he could have powered the emergency lights. You could say that. I'm better with sandwiches. And maybe soup that doesn't hover threateningly." She laughed then, a sound that seemed to ripple through the hall, making even the floating light orbs tremble in sympathy. It wasn't a royal laugh, rehearsed and perfect. It was genuine, edged with surprise, as if she hadn't expected to laugh at all. Encouraged and horribly aware of how ridiculous he must look, he wiped his sleeve, cleared his throat, and said, almost under his breath, "You're beautiful." Time seemed to stutter. The translator stayed silent, but he was sure she'd understood. Her eyes softened, the faintest flush rising along the delicate whorls at the base of her long ears. Then she smiled. Not the polished, diplomatic smile she'd offered to admirers and officials all evening, but a small, private thing. It was the kind of smile that suggested she, too, had been waiting for someone to say something that wasn't laced with titles or trembling awe. "Thank you," she murmured. "It's nice to hear it said simply." He managed a crooked grin. "Well, I'd offer you a sandwich to go with it, but I think security would vaporize me." She laughed again, covering her mouth with slender fingers tipped in silver filigree. The sound was brighter this time, like starlight hitting crystal. They spoke through the rest of the first course. She teased him gently about human dining rituals. "So, you put bread on both sides of the food?" While he confessed his terror of orbital elevators. When the dignitary to her left tried to draw her into a solemn discussion of trade tariffs, she excused herself politely, turning her attention back to him. He learned that her people, the Lyrian, traced ancestry not by bloodline alone but by the melody of the family name, passed down in song. She spoke of home worlds with seas that shone like molten sapphire, of palaces where the walls could remember conversations and recite them back in the voices of ancestors. He told her of rush-hour traffic, of late-night noodle stalls, and of the time he got locked out of his apartment wearing only a bath towel. When dessert arrived, tiny spheres of frozen mist that dissolved on the tongue, he accidentally inhaled one, choking spectacularly. His face turned the color of dying suns, and his cough echoed embarrassingly across the hall. Saris, to her credit, barely managed to contain her laughter, her shoulders shaking under the shimmer of her silken dress. "I think," she teased once he recovered, "you may be the bravest human here, or the most foolish. I've been called both," he wheezed, eyes watering. Usually on the same day. A bell chimed, signaling speeches. Dignitaries rose, holograms dancing over their heads as they spoke of alliances, shared futures, and the great tapestry of peace that bound the galaxy together. The words were grand, soaring right over his head, honestly. Saris listened politely, but every so often her gaze flicked back to him. Once, she mouthed a single word, "Bored," and he nodded, barely stifling a laugh. When the final speech ended, applause rippled through the hall. He clapped too, a beat too late, still reeling from the fact that this most legendary woman had chosen, for a few stolen moments, to treat him like someone worth talking to. As guests began drifting toward the next reception hall, Saris leaned close, the scent of alien spices and starflower perfume catching him off guard. "Will you be at the Arboretum later?" she asked softly. He nodded, words caught somewhere between his chest and throat. "Good," she said, her smile returning. Smaller this time, but no less real. "I'd like to hear more about these sandwiches." And just like that, the galaxy felt a little smaller and infinitely stranger, and far more wonderful than he'd ever dared imagine. The Arboretum of the Aurora's Grace wasn't just a garden. It was an entire drifting biome sealed within transparent alloy walls, orbiting around the ship's core like a slow, living satellite. Strange blossoms from dozens of worlds spiraled in low gravity, anchored to slender stems that seemed far too fragile to hold them. Bioluminescent moss clung to the walls in shifting patterns, spelling ancient Lyrian proverbs before dissolving into spirals of soft green light. He arrived early, hoping to get a moment to breathe and stop his heart from hammering quite so loudly. His reflection in the curved glass dome looked as nervous as he felt. Hair slightly out of place, collar twisted, an expression hovering between panic and wonder. Then Saris arrived, and the Arboretum seemed to shift around her. Not in any magical sense, though with her, who could be sure? But in the way that the drifting flowers seemed to lean just slightly closer, as though they too wanted to hear her speak. She wore a different gown this time, a flowing dark blue that shimmered like deep space, and silver cuffs shaped like curling tendrils wrapped around her long ears. "You came," she said softly, as though it was the most surprising thing in the world. "I figured I'd better," he replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Didn't want you to think humans were all talk and no walk." A small laugh escaped her, as soft as the rustle of the garden's floating petals. "I've been told human legs are quite well suited for walking." "Oh, they're excellent. Except mine sometimes forget what they're doing when I'm nervous." They began to drift along the garden's curved path, guided by slow-moving gravtiles that gently pushed them forward. Around them, pollen motes danced in intricate shapes, programmed by ancient Lyrian botanists to mimic constellations from lost star systems. She asked about his home, so he described late-night noodle stalls under flickering neon signs, stray cats that ruled the rooftops like tiny emperors, and vending machines that could serve hot soup, cold soda, or occasionally electrocute you if you kicked them too hard. "You Earth people live dangerously," she teased. "We do. We also eat things that shouldn't be food. Have you ever heard of something called processed cheese?" She shook her head, eyes wide in mock horror. "Processed? Oh yes, it's like cheese, but built in a lab by scientists who lost their way." She laughed again, covering her mouth briefly. A nearby orchid, sensitive to sound, opened its petals wider at her laughter, revealing glowing filaments that pulsed softly. "Your stories," she said. "They're wonderfully ordinary." "Thank you," he replied, surprised to find he meant it. "I guess that's all I've got, really. Just ordinary things." "They're not ordinary to me," she said, and for a moment her voice grew quieter. "Sometimes I think I'd trade every golden hall I've walked for an evening in one of your noodle shops. And sometimes," he offered, trying for humor to mask the sudden intimacy, "those noodle shops smell like burnt oil and disappointment. Still," she murmured, "they sound free." A soft chime sounded overhead, announcing the garden's water cycle. Artificial rain began to drift down. Not in drops, but in perfect, weightless spheres that floated among the blossoms. Ceres reached out, touching one gently with a fingertip, sending it spinning off in a lazy spiral. "I suppose you've had hundreds of people tell you how beautiful you are," he said, surprising himself. "Yes," she admitted. "Most of them say it like they're reciting a prayer." "I'm not really the praying type," he said. "But I do mean it." She turned to look at him then, and for a heartbeat, the playful curve of her lips softened into something fragile. "That's why it matters," she whispered. Just as quickly, the moment passed. She flicked a stray water sphere at him. It splashed across his shoulder, sending a small shiver of cold through his shirt. "Oh, it's on," he declared, scooping up another sphere and tossing it gently back. They ended up floating side by side, half laughing, half drenched. The grav tiles kept them steady, but his heart felt like it was spinning somewhere in the void. A pair of insect-sized maintenance drones buzzed past, scanning the droplets for contaminants. He watched them, grateful for something to anchor his gaze. "I hope you know," he said, breathless from laughing, "that you're ruining my reputation." "Oh," she teased. "Yeah, I'm supposed to be mysterious and brooding. But now the whole ship's going to know I lost a water fight to a woman in formal wear. And with longer ears," she added, mock serious. "Yes, that too. Unfair advantage, really?" They resumed walking, though neither spoke for a while. The silence felt companionable, wrapped around them like the gentle hum of the ship's life support systems. "I think," she said at last, "that you see me the way I wish to be seen. And how's that? Just someone. Not an idea. Not a myth." He thought about that, then said, "Fair warning. I'll probably still trip over my own feet trying to talk to you." "Fair warning," she echoed. "I might still get nervous and say something foolish." "Perfect," he replied. "We'll be nervous together." As they reached the garden's heart, a massive blossom slowly unfurled overhead, petals as broad as sails, revealing a swirling core of pale light. It cast a gentle glow over them, and for the briefest moment, they stood there, just breathing, the galaxy beyond the transparent dome spiraling on. "Will you come tomorrow?" she asked softly. "I'd like to," he said, voice catching on hope. "Then tomorrow," she whispered. As they parted, a drifting pollen mote landed on his shoulder, blinking once before fading to dark. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt like the universe winking at them. Just two souls, adrift in a garden between the stars. News spread across the Aurora's grace faster than a photon ping on the diplomatic network. The most admired woman in the galaxy had been seen laughing, truly laughing, with an awkward human who once nearly drowned himself in floating soup. It wasn't exactly the legacy he'd imagined, but it was a legacy nonetheless. By morning, his personal comm was flashing with a dozen unread requests from journalists, vloggers, and even a galactic cooking show offering to teach him to eat properly for the cameras. He ignored them all, though one automated message did get through. A politely worded memo warning him that the ship's security AI had flagged unusual attention around his quarters. The AI, speaking in a voice that sounded suspiciously like a patient librarian, recommended he avoid reckless gallantry or further aquatic food mishaps. At breakfast, he sat in the corner of the dining hall, eyes buried in a mug of synth coffee that tasted faintly of burnt metal. Across the room, a cluster of diplomats whispered behind elegantly carved masks. He caught the phrase dangerous precedent and something about destabilizing mythic value. He silently wished them a lifetime of soured space milk. His wish was interrupted by Ceres slipping into the seat beside him, her long ears adorned today with slender chains of interlinked crystal. They caught the pale morning light, scattering tiny rainbows across the table. "I heard," she said, amusement dancing in her voice, "that you're secretly here to steal the royal heirloom and abscond into a wormhole." "Well," he deadpanned, "it was either that or challenge the entire security team to a water fight, but the wormhole had better food." She laughed softly, leaning closer so her shoulder nearly brushed his. "I'm sorry about the attention. My life seems to do that to people." "I'll survive," he said. I've faced worse. Once ate week-old leftovers and lived. Her smile turned wistful. That might actually be braver. A buzzing overhead drew their gaze to a swarm of floating news drones, their lenses blinking like mechanical fireflies. One drone hovered too close, emitting a gentle hum as it focused on Saris's face. He stood, raising his mug. Sorry, private conversation. The drone chirped in confusion. He shooed it away with exaggerated shooing motions that made Saris stifle laughter behind her hand. It worked briefly. The drone retreated, its tiny propulsion fins twitching in what might have been annoyance. Saris tilted her head, crystal chains swaying. They won't stop, she said. Not as long as you keep being interesting. I could try being boring, he offered. Maybe stand perfectly still and talk only about tax policies. They'd call that enigmatic, she teased. And follow you anyway. Well then, he said. Want to escape? She raised a brow. Where? Maintenance sector. Hardly glamorous, but the drones avoid it because of the magnetic shielding. She hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. Lead the way, mysterious sandwich philosopher. They ducked through corridors lined with humming conduits and flickering status panels. At one point, a trio of engineer bots rumbled past on tank treads, each balancing crates labeled, critical, do not shake. He saluted them solemnly. Saris barely contained her laughter. They found a quiet corner behind a heat exchanger, where the vibration made conversation feel oddly intimate. Pipes overhead dripped condensation into tiny catch basins, and the scent of ozone hung in the air. I used to come here, she confessed, fingertips brushing the bulkhead. When I was a girl traveling on my father's diplomatic tours, the guards couldn't follow me through the tighter conduits. You ran from your guards? He asked, grinning. Only once, she said. Or maybe 27 times. They laughed together, the hum of the exchanger filling the pauses. When the laughter faded, she spoke quietly. Do you ever wish you could disappear? Not forever. Just long enough to breathe. Every day, he admitted. Though disappearing on a ship this size seems tricky. There's a storage hold, she said, her voice light but her gaze searching his. Empty except for unused projection rigs. No cameras. The guards don't bother checking it. You're suggesting royal trespass, he said. Sounds scandalous. Scandalous? She echoed, amusement flickering across her face. But peaceful. They made their way there, pausing only when a passing protocol droid offered them directions with unsettling cheerfulness. The hold was cavernous, lit only by thin lines of emergency lighting. Holographic projectors hung dormant from the ceiling like sleeping bats. They sat on a crate-stamped stage set. Do not drop, shoulders brushing lightly. The silence felt deeper here, broken only by the soft hum of the ship's engines. It feels normal, she whispered, to sit like this, to talk, even to do nothing. He risked a glance at her, the galaxy's most beautiful woman, sitting cross-legged on a dusty crate, tracing circles in the condensation with one graceful finger. You know, he said, voice dry, you've ruined my ability to be impressed by fancy banquets. Oh? She asked, tilting her head. Well, he said, they don't come with hidden maintenance lounges and secret conversations. And what about sandwich stories? She teased. Those too, he said, though I've got plenty more if you ever want them. Her smile softened, something unguarded flashing across her face. I would, she whispered. A distant clang echoed through the hold. Maybe a worker bot, maybe the ship settling. But they stayed where they were, shoulders touching, in that tiny corner where status, myth, and history seemed to pause. I think, he said, voice low, you're the bravest person I've met. Why? She asked, brows lifting. Because you dare to be real, even when the galaxy demands you be a legend. She looked away, ears dipping slightly. A Lyrian gesture he'd learned meant vulnerability. Then she met his gaze again, and for a heartbeat, neither spoke. When they finally slipped back into the corridor, the news drones were waiting, but somehow the weight of their gaze felt lighter, the absurdity of it all easier to bear. They walked side by side, sharing small jokes about malfunctioning food dispensers and the time she nearly called a planetary governor by the wrong title. The galaxy outside remained as vast and complicated as ever. But between them, something simple and human had quietly taken root, stubborn as life itself. A warning pulse blinked across his comm band just as he stepped into the corridor. Environmental fluctuation detected. Unexpected temperature drop in adjacent sectors. He glanced up, expecting to see an apologetic maintenance bot rumbling past. But the hall was empty except for the soft swirl of ventilation fog rolling along the floor. He'd barely had time to register the cold seeping into his sleeves when Saris appeared at the end of the corridor, breath curling white in the air. Her dark gown shimmered with frost at the hem, and her long ears glowed faintly, flushed by the sudden chill. "You got the warning too?" he asked, voice rasping in the thin, frigid air. "I did," she said, hugging her arms close. "I'm beginning to think your talent for disaster is contagious." "Could be," he admitted. "But I promise I didn't sabotage the climate controls. My skill set stops at setting off fire alarms with burnt toast." A thin laugh escaped her, fogging between them before fading. Another pulse buzzed on his comm, the words flickering. "Emergency system reset in progress. Seek shelter." "This way," she urged, tugging at his sleeve. "There's a maintenance observatory near the ship's dorsal spine. It holds residual heat longer." They hurried along corridors rimmed with frost so thin it crackled underfoot. Overhead, the normally smooth lighting panels flickered between dim gold and cold blue. His breath felt sharp in his lungs, but Saris kept moving, steps light despite the ice dusting the floor. They pushed through a narrow hatch, and warmth spilled over them like a sigh. The observatory was small, its curved walls transparent alloy showing a dizzying view of the galaxy, stars tumbling across a backdrop of swirling nebulae. The main generator's heat ran beneath the floor, leaving a narrow strip of warm plating that they shuffled onto gratefully. "I knew you had a plan," he said, exhaling heavily. "Remind me never to doubt royalty." "Technically, this is closer to trespassing than planning," she replied, voice edged with dry humor. "But it works." He glanced at her, noticing how her ears had flushed with color again, the shimmering filigree of her cuffs catching starlight. "Are they very sensitive to the cold?" he asked, nodding at them. "They are," she admitted. "An unfortunate trait in a family that loves ceremony halls chilled for dramatic effect." "I'd offer you my jacket," he said, "but you'd end up wearing what amounts to a slightly damp rag." She smiled faintly, stepping closer to the warmth of the floor. "I'd accept it anyway. It would be impolite not to." He slipped it off, draping it over her shoulders. The sleeves hung awkwardly, and the collar was too wide, but she settled it around her anyway, breathing in the faint, unremarkable human scent. "You smell like ozone and coffee," she teased gently. "High praise," he said. "Usually I just smell like panic and cheap soap." She laughed, leaning back against the transparent wall, eyes turned to the stars beyond. "You know," she murmured, "it's strange. I've stood in 100 such observatories, and it always felt lonely. And now, less lonely," she said, voice barely above a whisper. They stood together in silence, the view beyond them a slow dance of light. He found himself pointing out constellations he barely remembered from childhood star maps, lines of imaginary heroes and ancient myths sketched across the dark. "That one there," he said, squinting, "looks like a cat caught in a door. A heroic creature," she intoned solemnly, "honored for its sacrifice. And that cluster over there," he continued, "is the Great Sandwich, named after the brave inventor who first put 2 slices of bread around mystery meat and called it lunch." She chuckled, shaking her head so the chains on her ears swayed. "The humans' contributions to galactic culture truly are unparalleled." "Not to brag," he said, "but we also have instant noodles. And you say this with pride?" "Oh, absolutely. They're terrible and perfect at the same time." The humor warmed the chill between them, melting the thin crust of fear left by the ship's malfunction. Outside, the stars wheeled on, uncaring. Then her voice dropped, more serious. This incident, it may not have been an accident. His chest tightened. You mean someone wanted to hurt you? Or scare me, she said. Perhaps scare both of us. A rumor already circles. That I'm distracted. That I've forgotten my duty. He met her gaze, searching for the truth behind her calm. Have you? He asked softly. She hesitated, long ears dipping slightly. I haven't forgotten, she said. But for the first time, I question what my duty really is. I don't know much about duty, he admitted. But I do know you deserve to be more than a symbol. She looked away, blinking against something that might have been mist or unshed tears. Symbols don't get cold, she whispered. Symbols don't laugh at sandwich jokes. And symbols definitely don't look good in stolen jackets, he added, forcing a grin that coaxed a small, genuine laugh. She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against his hand. Thank you, she murmured, for reminding me I'm still real. I'd offer to pinch you, he teased, but I'm afraid your guards would vaporize me. They might, she agreed, voice lighter now, and it would be terribly inconvenient to explain. The comm on his wrist chirped again. System restoration complete. Temperature normalizing. Slowly, the cold in the corridor outside faded. They stayed a few moments longer, just watching the slow spin of the galaxy. Come, she said finally, straightening. They'll come looking for us soon. Let them, he replied. We've got a good excuse. Environmental crisis, heroic jacket loan, and 2 witnesses to each other's bravery, she finished, smile returning. They stepped back into the corridor, warmth returning in measured pulses through the ship's plating. The threat hadn't vanished, but it felt smaller now, softened by humor, shared silence, and a jacket that no longer quite smelled only of him, but faintly of starflower perfume. They walked side by side, and even as the ship's guards and news drones turned toward them, it felt, if only for a little while, as if the universe had bent just enough to make room for something tender and defiantly real. The Convergence banquet glittered under a living dome of glass, each pane alive with shifting images of the spiral galaxy beyond. Dignitaries in robes laced with stardust took their places, guarded by silent drones hovering like wary hawks. At the center table, under the unblinking gaze of thousands, Ceres sat poised, the weight of generations balanced on the graceful curve of her long ears. He stood at the edge of the hall, half hidden behind a pillar etched with ancient Lyrian script that shimmered faintly when touched by the passing light. His suit, borrowed once more from the ship's quartermaster, had been hastily pressed. It still smelled faintly of anti-static spray and old starch. His heart pounded like a wild drum. An envoy's voice droned on about the galaxy's fragile unity and the historic role of Ceres's family. He heard only fragments, lost in the blur of hope and fear. She looked composed, serene, but every so often her gaze flickered across the hall, seeking him. Each glance felt like an invisible thread binding them across the crowd. A holographic sigil rotated in the air before her, the ceremonial sign of her assent to an ancient alliance that would bind her to someone else, in duty if not in heart. The crowd held its breath. He shifted, almost stepped forward, but caught himself. This wasn't his place, and he knew it. And yet something in him rebelled, a stubborn spark refusing to fade. Ceres's hand hovered over the sigil. Her fingers trembled once, almost imperceptibly, then stilled. Slowly, she drew her hand back. A hush rippled through the hall, followed by the sharp intake of breath from diplomats, advisors, and guards alike. She rose, the silver cuffs on her ears catching the dome's shifting light. I cannot offer my heart where it has already chosen, she said, voice steady despite the silence crashing down around her. The crowd erupted, some in outrage, some in confusion. The holographic sigil flickered uncertainly before dissolving into starlight. For a moment he forgot how to breathe. The weight of it pressed into his chest until he felt dizzy. Then she turned fully, her eyes finding him across the distance. A guard moved as if to stop her, but she stepped past him, gown whispering against the polished floor. Her path cut through the noise, dignitaries parting like drifting nebulae before a comet's passage. She stopped before him, close enough that he could see the faint tremor in her shoulders. "You once asked if I'd forgotten my duty," she murmured, voice low enough only he could hear. "But duty without choice is only a cage. I didn't want to be the reason you broke tradition," he whispered back. "Then let me be the reason we made a new one," she replied. Behind them, the hall buzzed like a disturbed hive, but her gaze never left his. He realized then how far they had come, from hesitant words over floating soup to this impossible, terrifying defiance. "May I?" she asked, and before he could answer, she took his hand in hers. The galaxy shimmered above them, 1,000 stars reflected in her eyes. A dignitary shouted something about protocol. Another raised a ceremonial staff in warning. Ceres only tightened her grip. "Do you trust me?" she whispered. "With everything," he said, his voice breaking a little. "Then walk with me." They stepped forward together, past stunned envoys and twitching security drones. His heart raced, but humor surfaced anyway. "We're about to make a lot of history professors very angry. Let them write their angry books," she said, lips twitching into a smile. "At least they'll spell our names right." The ceremonial AI, programmed for perfect solemnity, faltered in its speech, voice stuttering like a skipping disc. A few dignitaries protested, but others watched in silent wonder. In that moment, the hall felt less like a cage of tradition and more like the heart of something being born. As they reached the center dais, the holographic dome overhead shimmered. The galaxy seemed to pulse brighter, as though the ship itself recognized a choice made freely. His hand in hers felt warm, real, and utterly improbable. Afterward, in the quieter hours, they sat together on a balcony open to the stars. She slipped off the silver cuffs from her ears, setting them gently beside her. "Symbols have weight," she said softly, "but sometimes it's right to set them down." He watched the distant suns reflect in the curve of her ears, still graceful, still unmistakably hers. "You're still Ceres," he said, "with or without them. And you," she teased, leaning into him, "are still terrible at soup." They laughed together, relief and fear and wonder all tangled up. Somewhere behind them, new alliances would be debated, old ones rewritten. The galaxy would spin on indifferent and eternal. But here, on this small balcony on a drifting ship of glass and metal, something had shifted. She was no longer the most beautiful woman in the universe only because others said so. She was beautiful because she had chosen to be seen, and to see in return. He realized then how far he had come too. From a man afraid to speak, to one who had dared to matter to someone beyond every myth. The galaxy remained impossibly vast, but for the first time it felt smaller. Not because it had changed, but because he had. As the stars wheeled overhead, they stayed like that. Two souls adrift in cosmic seas, tethered not by duty or legend, but by words whispered honestly, laughter shared freely, and the simple, stubborn hope that even in a universe of ancient certainties, something new could still begin.